Greetings, everyone, and welcome back to Subversive History. My name is Patrick. My co-host Johnny is unable to join us today, but he is here with us in spirit. Today, we are extremely gracious to be joined by Neve Gordan. Our guest is a professor of international law and human rights at Queen Mary University of London. Professor Gordan is the author of numerous books, including Human Shields, A History of People in the Line of Fire, which he co-authored with Nicola Perugini. Neve Gordan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pat, thanks so much for inviting me.
Okay. I was thinking that maybe before getting into the specifics of your book, it might be helpful to our audience to have a little bit of a biographical introduction to you. For those who are not aware, you were born in Israel, you served in the IDF, you were also a professor at Ben Gurion University. As someone who had experienced life in Israel as a citizen, a soldier, and an academic, can you describe what experiences motivated you to become critical of the state of Israel?
So I actually began a certain kind of path already in high school, way back when, with a few friends that we would go. This was in the early 1980s. We would join a movement called Peace Now to protest the illegal Jewish settlements in the West Bank. Peace Now is a liberal Zionist organization. During my undergraduate at Hebrew University, while I was studying philosophy, I would sit in the classroom. This was the height of the first Palestinian Intifada in the late 1980s. And so you would be sitting in the classroom and there would be bombs just outside from East Jerusalem and so forth. And I joined a human rights group that started going to Gaza every week to collect testimonies of human rights abuses. And later I became the first director of Physicians for Human Rights, Israel, until after the Oslo Accords were signed. But actually, I was still within the liberal Zionist camp at that time, and it was only with the eruption of the first Intifada in 2000 when I helped found the Jerusalem group called Ta'ayush, which means in Arabic, living together. And we would go regularly to the West Bank. And it was through the meetings with the Palestinians in the West Bank and what they were going through that I became much more critical of the state of Israel and its policies towards the Palestinians. And I began to understand it as a colonial project. So it was then, and I was very active in the territories during those years. And later we also, my partner and I, helped with a few other families found a Jewish Palestinian school, which is an outlier in the Israeli scene where there's over 2 million children, but only 1,500 study in non-segregated schools.
Right.
And so it was these kind of experiences that led me to understand the depth of the racism of apartheid and the colonial project, through that slowly I kind of built a critical perspective to what is going on.
And now I know you were, as I mentioned before, you were involved in academia in Israel. And, how was your political dissidence received while you were living and teaching in Israel?
So at the time, particularly in the early years, what was allowed to say, the kind of what was conceived as legitimate debate was actually much broader in Israel than, say, the United States. So when I would come and give talks in the United States, and say things that I regularly said in Israel, I was continuously attacked in the United States for saying those things.
Would it be from like Zionist groups in the United States, or would it be like evangelical Zionist groups, like things like that?
Yeah, it was either evangelicals, it was either Christians or Jewish Zionists that would criticize me. It was often more hurtful to them that I was a Jew saying these things than had I not been a Jew.
Right.
And so I understood that the kind of what was permissible in Israel at the time was much greater. Now, what we've seen in the past years in Israel is how that kind of sphere of what is permissible discourse has narrowed considerably over the years. And the kind of first major attack against free speech and the kind of process where I slowly started to feel that my views were no longer legitimate in Israel, or at least in the dominant circles in Israel, is when I wrote an op-ed for the LA Times in 2009 supporting the BDS movement. Mm-hmm. And at that time, the Minister of Education asked the president to fire me from the university. I had already tenure, and it was difficult to fire me. So the way the university dealt with it is that they basically took half the line of my partner, who was also teaching at the university and still did not have tenure. So they were punishing her for things that I said, and we had to go to lawyers and we had to have a campaign in order to reinstate her. But at that time, it became very clear that the permissible discourse was narrowing. And over the years, it got a bit worse. I do need to mention that I was teaching in the politics and government department at the time, and the staff were amazingly supportive of me and of what I said. I'm not saying this to indicate that they agreed with what I said, but they agreed, or they thought I should have the space to say it, and that what I was saying was not illegal, and therefore it was permissible. Right. So my kind of inner circle was extremely supportive of my work. But outside, it became more and more difficult to voice these kinds of opinions. Today, after October 7th, opinions like mine cannot be said out loud in a university setting in Israel.
And this type of reaction to the things you were saying went as far as you and your partner both receiving death threats, as well as the situations going on with your employment, correct?
Exactly. So there was, years ago, I would still write op-eds for the Jerusalem Post, and it's mainly an online outlet.
Right.
And the article would appear overnight on its online because a lot of its readers are in the United States or Europe. I would wake up in the morning and I'd have sometimes over 100 hate mails by 7 in the morning. And so I got used to this kind of hate. I still get it, not at that level. And some of those were, a lot of them were with sexual overtones. Some of them were threatening with violence. Right. And then I think maybe you read about a threat of violence. That was more not through the internet, but actually someone put a letter in my mailbox. And that's why it was a bit more, they had to know where I am and so forth in order to put it there.
So it's interesting when I think about all this, because we've interviewed Ilan Pape, who lives in England. We've interviewed Avi Schleim, who lives in England. We're speaking to you now, who no longer lives in Israel. You also live in England. In a couple weeks, we're speaking to Shur Havar, and he lives in Germany. What I guess my question, just based on all that, is like, we constantly hear, at least in the United States, that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. What do you think about that statement when you think about all of these academics that are critical of the state that they were living in, that can no longer comfortably or safely live in that society while being critical of it?
Well, let me first begin by saying that the reason we left Israel was that we didn't want to raise our children in an apartheid regime.
Right.
And that relates to your question because that tells you how I understand Israeli democracy.
Yes.
Israel is a democracy for people like me,
right,
who are Jews, Ashkenazi Jews. But it is not a democracy for the Palestinians, not exactly a democracy for the Palestinian citizens of Israel, and certainly not a democracy for the Palestinians in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip.
Right.
And so my sense was that we want to raise our children within a context that is much less racist, and that the racism is not out there in the world in your everyday encounters, and not so much because of a danger to our well-being. I think Shir and Ilan and Avi, who lived there only when he was a child, would agree that they do not necessarily feel danger to their lives due to their privilege of being Jews, or that they didn't leave because of a danger to their lives. I do think the situation after October 7th has changed, and Jews are assaulted, particularly in the West Bank. So if, for example, during my activism in the West Bank, I would regularly go to the South Hebron region to spend time with the villages there who were constantly being threatened of ethnic cleansing.
Right.
And there would be encounters with the military, with the police, and with the settlers, but I didn't encounter personally violence against my own person at the time. Today, the Jews that go and try to do the same work in the West Bank are repeatedly beaten and injured by the settlers, and at times even by the police and by the military. So the situation on the ground has changed, I think, quite dramatically in the past couple of years.
And I think that's a really important clarification that you made there. I framed my question kind of about the personal experiences of these academics that, like yourself, that are critical. And I kind of framed it in a way that was like, it was like a self-preservation, like, oh no, I'm being harassed. I lost my job and I left. And I kind of, I glossed over what the real issue is that it's not like, oh, I'm receiving emails or I can't, my job is discriminating against me based on what I'm saying. It's more so like we fundamentally morally disagree with the apartheid that we're witnessing, and I don't want to raise my children in this. So I did want to just point out how much I appreciate that clarification. To get into your book, I think for anyone listening to this, anyone following the Israel-Palestine conflict over the past 20 or so years will be very familiar with the term human shields. However, despite the excessive weaponization of the term in the media, very little has been written on the topic in an academic sense. And that's why I found your book so interesting. It's kind of a niche topic that I haven't seen many books about that are tackling the issue of human shielding specifically. And it's mentioned so often, whether by Israel or by the United States or anyone that's defending what's going on in Gaza right now. My question for you is, what motivated you to write on the topic of human shields specifically?
So in my previous book, The Human Right to Dominate, we came across, we were looking at one point at Gaza, and I'm not talking Gaza today, but Gaza in 2008 actually, and in 2012. And we suddenly noticed that every time Israel was criticized for carrying out war crimes in the Gaza Strip at the time, the way it defended itself was through the human shields argument. So every time a human rights organization or the United Nations would accuse Israel of disproportionately killing civilians in the Gaza Strip or attacking hospitals in the Gaza Strip, it would say that actually it was targeting Hamas or Islamic Jihad, and that they were using the civilians as human shields or the hospital as a shield, and therefore actually it is Hamas and to blame for the death or for the damage and injuries carried out in these attacks. And that sparked a certain kind of interest, that justification. And what we did is we actually put a Google alert for human shields to see when it is mentioned in the media in general. And we started seeing that it is kind of prominent and actually over the years gaining prominence as a kind of justification for what we thought were crimes. And that spurred us to say, okay, let's study this. Who is this human shield? What are human shields? What is the history? When did it first emerge in war and so forth? And that kind of sparked the book.
I think while the term human shields is contemporarily understood as a means to disparage non-white nations' military endeavors or self-defense or liberation attempts, your book provides an interesting historical perspective to the phenomenon of human shielding, which reveals that Western and European nations were not above the practice of human shielding whatsoever. You referenced the American Civil War, the Franco-Prussian War, and the Boer War in South Africa. Can you kind of describe that historical foundation of human shielding for our audience?
So first, maybe let me define human shields, just so everyone's clear what we mean when we say human shield. The laws of war today have two major figures. They have the civilian and they have the combatant.
Right.
And according to as opposed to human rights law, where you're not allowed to kill people, according to the laws of war, you're allowed to kill people. You're allowed to kill combatants, but you're not allowed to kill civilians. Civilians are protected people. A human shield is a protected person, whether it's a civilian or a prisoner of war, people that you're not allowed to kill, that is either volunteers or is being used as a shield for a legitimate military target. So let's say there's a group of soldiers and they want to shield themselves and they put a few civilians in front of them as they march in a city. That is a human shield. There are also voluntary human shields, people that decide to use their body as a mode of protection and deterrence against militaries. A paradigmatic example of this would be Rachel Corrie that went to visit Rafah in Gaza, or the human shields that went from the United States to Iraq in the first Iraq War. Okay, and a third kind of human shield that we found is what's called proximate shields. It's people that are cast as human shield because they're in proximity to the fighting. We'll get to that later in the conversation. Now, you asked me, you asked me about the history of human shields. So human shields were used probably from the beginning of war. However, we begin the book 150 years ago when the laws of war began to emerge and be codified with the Lieber Code during the American Civil War. And we found this exchange of letters from Charleston in South Carolina, which was under siege in 1863, where the general in charge of Charleston writes to the general that is carrying out the siege and bombing the city from time to time and blockading it from allowing food to enter the city, something not unlike what we're seeing a bit in Gaza today. Mm-hmm. And the letter, the general inside Charleston writes to the general outside of Charleston saying, listen, I just received 50 officers, prisoners of war, from the north, and I am kind of distributing them in the city. And if you continue bombing, there's a good chance you'll end up killing one of your officers that are prisoners.
Right.
Now, what is interesting about Charleston at the time is that half the population were Black. Mm-hmm. More than half the population were women and children. None of them
kind of like Gaza.
Kind of Gaza. None of them could be considered human shields at the time, because the only people that had deterrence or thought they would have deterrence were the officers. Right. So it's not even the rank and file that couldn't deter. It was people of higher class. The officers at the time were of higher class. Yeah. And the general inside Charleston thought that they would be able to deter the fighting, and he placed them around the city. Of course, it didn't work. The general outside continued bombing the city and actually placed prisoners of war in front of his troops. So if Charleston tried to shoot back, they would be killing their own. But what this tells us also is that the history of human shielding is also the history of who is considered fully human.
Value, yeah.
And the only people that were valued as fully human at the time were the white men of an upper class. Mm-hmm. And slowly over the years, this changes. So if once white men were only used as human shields, today we hardly see white people being used as human shields. It's mostly people of color, mostly right. Women and children, and I can explain that later if you want. But that is kind of the first instance we begin with. Later we see it in as you said, in the Boer War in South Africa. We see it in the Franco-Prussian War in between France and Germany. A similar cases of white men being used as human shields.
You also make a very interesting and apt point about human shielding as it's been understood historically. And this is in reference to the Boer War, where obviously you have the British, and then you have the Dutch, who are the settlers in South Africa. And then you also have a Black population of the indigenous people that lived in South Africa. And you bring up, you say human shielding would have probably passed unnoticed if the people used as shields had been Black, referencing that when it was the Boers, the Dutch people of European descent, now you start to see more of an outcry and more of an outrage about the use of the human shielding by the British. But like in colonial endeavors, wherever it may be throughout Africa, if this type of thing was applied to Black people, the Black people that lived there, you wouldn't have seen the same outrage. And you really highlight that racial dimension in the understanding of human shielding. So
the human shielding exposes the racial dimension that was much broader. The laws of war themselves were inapplicable to the colonized population. You could kill the savages, so right. to speak, quote unquote, at will, and it wasn't considered a crime. You carried out crimes only when you killed other white people.
Right.
And so what the human shield exposes exactly how that works. So if it's in Charleston or if it's in South Africa, the Blacks don't even enter the script, so to speak, when you talk about crimes or when you talk about justice or so forth, you could do as you will with them. So in many ways, we use the figure of the human shield, which is a kind of liminal figure between the combatant and the civilian, in order to tell a much broader history of the use of the laws of war and of the racism within the laws of war, because these laws were created originally by Western states that were all colonizers. And they didn't want the laws of war to limit their colonization projects. So what we see here is basically how the laws of war that we still use today have a racial dimension in them. And if I jump forward just to kind of show that, is that almost all of the human shields today are people of color. And they are not white. And then the question is why? Why people of color could not be human shields at the turn of the 20th century. But today, practically all human shields, or almost all human shields, are people of color. And the reason is that after decolonization, the laws of war became applicable to the former colonized state. And you could know, and their people, the people that lived in the former colonized, were no longer savages. They were now civilians, and they were protected according to the laws of war. So how do we solve that problem of justifying the killing of people of color in war zones?
People that are now recognized as human beings with rights.
As human beings. It makes
that more complicated.
It makes it more complicated. And here, human shields plays a crucial role. What we have in many war zones now, and in the Gaza Strip, you see it very clearly, but you see it in other war zones at all, is the disappearance of the civilian.
Right. Altogether.
So what is there in the Gaza Strip today? There's military-aged men, MAM, which is an acronym the United States created, which is anywhere between, let's say, the age of 14 and 70. So any man between that age that you kill is a potential terrorist, quote unquote, and therefore legitimate to kill. Right. What do we do with the women and children and elderly? They are human shields. Let's cast all of them as human shields, and we'll discuss how that is being done in the Gaza Strip. Let's cast all of them as human shields. And if we kill them, then the party responsible for their death is not us. It's the people that use them as human shields, because because to use someone as human shield is a war crime, they set this process into motion. So even though I shot them as the Israeli or as an American, I'm not to blame. You're to blame because you use them as human shields. And what we see in many theaters of violence in the world today is how the civilian has almost completely disappeared, according to these warring parties like Israel.
One historical example that you use that I found extremely relevant to Israel's current strategy in Gaza is the case of fascist Italy during its invasion of Ethiopia. As your book mentions, during this invasion, the Italians claimed that the Ethiopians were, quote, using field hospitals to shield combatants and military supplies, and therefore the bombing of the hospitals was legitimate. Can you expand on the strategic similarities between Israel's current operation in the Gaza Strip as it pertains to hospitals and Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia?
So Mussolini begins this in Libya, actually, in 1912 already, and then
that was the first aerial bombing from an airplane in human history, right?
Yes, and it was directed also against medical units, and then he just continues it in Ethiopia, and basically the claim was that Ethiopian militants were hiding under the Red Cross emblem and using it as a shield. And therefore, the medical units lose their protections according to the law, and it is legitimate to bomb them. Now, it's not so simple, but that is the argument, and what is interesting about that moment of fascist Italy occupying Ethiopia in the 30s is that the arguments are uncannily similar, and even the kind of pictures and the kind of designs, like Israel produces these infographics to justify the bombing of hospitals. The Italian fascist regime did the same to justify the bombings of the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross Hospitals in Ethiopia. And what we see also interesting here is how the humanitarians, the ICRC in this case, are also racist and also say that the Ethiopians do not understand the laws of war and do not understand this kind of general distinction between protected people and sites and legitimate people and
almost
sites.
Like a paternalistic racism from the Red Cross.
Yeah. Now, there's several problems here. One is there's a fabrication. For example, in the cases that Israel is now using in the Gaza Strip, often later it turns out that it was completely fabricated. Right. There was nothing there. So Israel, for example—
Speaking of the infographics, they're like a 3D model that show like a multi-layered just command center of military operation. And we haven't seen anything in reality that reflects that, right?
So, for example, exactly. So Israel knows that it wants to attack Shifa Hospital. So preemptively, its media unit, the IDF media unit, produces a 3D video clip, invests probably thousands in order to produce it. And the video clip shows you as if the Hamas headquarters are located right under El Shifa Hospital. And then the Israeli army bombs parts of Shifa Hospital. Its soldiers enter Shifa Hospital. They take over the hospital. They search the whole hospital, but lo and behold, there's no central command center under Shifa Hospital. Now, we see a repetition of these kinds of fabrication, and it's not only what we see. The Goldstone report, which went and looked at the 2008-2009 attacks on Gaza Strip, said the same thing, said it came in later, it looked for evidence, it could not find any evidence of this use. Now, I'm not saying that Hamas fighters don't enter the hospitals.
Right.
I'm not saying that they didn't bring hostages to be treated in the hospitals and that their combatants are not treated in the hospitals. In fact, that's what the hospital is for also, not only to treat the civilian. And that is not a reason for attack. So we see part of what's going on here is a fabrication as a kind of preemptive legal defense for attacking a site that is considered protected according to the laws of war. And we see that continuously, and we see also an increase, not only by Israel, but by other actors, where human shield is the kind of, silver bullet of defense against killing civilians and destroying life-saving institutions like hospitals, clinics, ambulances, and so forth.
You mentioned before this concept of proximate human shielding, and your book references a pivotal change in the definition of human shielding that will be extremely relevant to the more modern conflicts that we'll be discussing. if I understand your book correctly, a human shield was defined within the binary of voluntary versus involuntary, historically. Voluntary meaning someone could offer themselves as a human shield, risking their own life to protect someone or something. And involuntary meaning someone is literally forced to shield something entirely against their will. However, this definition was altered to include civilians who were just merely in the proximity of a military target or combatant. Can you describe the implications of this shift in categorizing who is and who is not a human shield?
So first, just to give it a sense of the quantity. So we did an examination of newspapers to see the mentioning of human shields. And we looked at a certain period over a year and found that major newspapers like the New York Times, the Guardian, and so forth mentioned incidents with human shielding. And if we looked at the numbers, it reached well over 1 million, I think, of human shields. But then when we broke it down to the 3 categories, out of well over 1 million incidents, I think there was 1 or 2 of voluntary shields, less than 1% of involuntary shields, and everyone else was proximate shields. So it's not a situation where I volunteer like Rachel Corrie. It's not a situation where you, let's say, as a soldier, coerce me or force me to serve as a human shield, but it's a situation that I am in a city. And because I'm in a city and the city has become a war zone, because I'm a civilian, I'm immediately cast as a human shield. Now, we thought this was the case. But then we found out that it's a bit more complicated. And there was a kind of natural experiment for us, so to speak, because we looked at Mosul in Iraq, and Mosul was captured by ISIS in 2014. And then recaptured by the Iraqi coalition, which is the Iraqi army that the Americans created, and the United States in 2016. And in 2014, the Iraqi army was in Mosul. ISIS attacked it, and the soldiers fled, and ISIS took over. And in no newspaper is the term human shield mentioned in relation to the attack. In 2016, when the Iraqi army is preparing to recapture Mosul from ISIS hands, suddenly we read headlines. ISIS, they were, 800 fighters at the time, were holding 100,000 civilians as human shields. And this is a claim by the Iraqi coalition that was then repeated by the United Nations and then later repeated by Amnesty and maybe Human Rights Watch. And it shows us something very interesting. It shows us that the proximity is not proximity to the fighting per se, but it's proximity to non-state actors. So when Israel bombs Gaza and civilians are killed, they are human shields because they're in proximity to a non-state actor. But when Hamas bombs Tel Aviv, and Israel's central command is in the center of Tel Aviv, and there's, I think, 30 schools in a radius of 1 mile from the central command in Tel Aviv.
That's not
nowhere does anyone say that Israel is using human shields to defend its central command center. And nowhere are the Israeli civilians that live in Tel Aviv cast as human shields. Okay? So what we see here again is a double privileging, a privileging of whites over non-whites and a privileging of state actors over non-state actors, okay? And the laws of war privilege state actors over non-state actors very clearly.
Your book cites Vietnam as an example of this new form of proximity human shielding. And some of the examples that you bring up in regards to Vietnam, I found, to use the word that you said, uncanny in their similarities to current things going on in Gaza. For example, you cite some pamphlets which were dropped by the United States that say things like, why do they, meaning the Vietnamese Liberation Army, why do they use villages as a base to fight? Why do the VC always hide in the midst of the people? Why must they continue to use defenseless women and children as shields and villages for protection? You know, in Vietnam, we have hindsight. I think many, many people are pretty critical of the Vietnam War and the gross amount of human life that was lost in the atrocities of those bombing campaigns. However, the justification by the United States is almost exactly the same as what's currently being said in Gaza. Would you agree with that?
Yes. However, I would say the scale in Gaza has increased. So
Okay.
if in Vietnam they would talk about a village being used as a shield, in Gaza, it's the whole Gaza Strip. So it would be like the whole Vietnam becomes
Right.
one big shield. And how does that work? So on the one hand, Gaza is not a break from history, as you point out.
Right.
Gaza is a continuation of history and a form of justification, but it's a massive intensification of that kind of logic. And the way Israel carries it is fascinating. But before I touch on that, I would just like to say that in Vietnam, the Viet Cong basically did what's called a people's war.
Yeah.
Where the distinction between the people and the militants doesn't really hold. Now, if we think of the history of the United States and the War of Revolution, that distinction didn't hold too. Everyone was conscripted into the effort of getting rid of the English from the United States, okay? Again, everyone was part of the effort in Vietnam to get rid of the U.S. occupier. And what we see is that when the U.S. bombs a village, it uses this kind of justification in order to justify what it did in that village in terms of the amount of civilians it killed. And the U.S. killed millions of civilians in Gaza, in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Now, in the Gaza Strip, this has changed. And one of the reasons I think it has changed is that we know that Hamas has built probably hundreds of kilometers of tunnels under the Gaza Strip. Now, the tunnels are what's called a legitimate military target, right? They are using these tunnels to hide, to shield their weapons, to carry out attacks from the tunnels. So basically, what Israel is saying is that everything above the tunnels is a shield.
Legitimate, yeah.
Okay? And therefore, anything that it bombs, it can always say it was protecting a shield, and therefore it is legitimate. Now, it's not legitimate to bomb a legitimate military target that's protected by shields. You still have to follow certain principles of the law,
Distinction,
the principle of proportionality and so forth. So, but these rules are open-ended to interpretation. There is nowhere written what proportionality means.
Right.
Proportionality is defined as that you have to balance the anticipated harm with the anticipated military advantage. Now, what we see warring parties do in order to justify the proportional kind of calculations they do is they inflate the value of the military advantage, and they deflate the value of the civilian harm. So in northern Gaza, Israel has already killed 5 times the head of northern Gaza, Hamas's head, which is probably a 21-year-old person.
Right.
It kills. We had killed the head of Gaza. That justifies 100 civilian death.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next day, there's a new head of Gaza, 21-year-old. And the next day, and they inflate this kind of thing to justify each Hamas member up to 100 deaths of civilians, which is unheard of in military calculations. So we see that constantly happening in the Gaza Strip. And we see the kind of inflation, for example, in the example we discussed before with the 3D model, where they don't say there's a Hamas depot of arms under El Shifa. They say the central command of Hamas is under Shifa. Right. We inflate it because Shifa, it's clear, it's the biggest hospital in the Gaza Strip. And if we want to bomb it, we have to show that what's underneath it is much more important than what it is. So that's the kind of legal work is done. And legal work is interpretive work. And you use what's called the fog of war to interpret any way that you want so that it advances your goal.
So you had published your book in 2020, correct? Which is obviously 3 years prior to the events of October 7th and Israel's subsequent campaign of genocide in the Gaza Strip. Obviously, when you're writing about IDF's actions in your book, you're referencing Protective Edge, Cast Lead, which in comparison, as brutal as they were, I believe each of those had, maybe a couple thousand deaths. And now we're looking at a conflict in Gaza, which is orders of magnitude more deadly for civilians and just much more intensive. Obviously, the concept of human shields is more relevant now than it even was when you had written the book. So my question is how does the subject of human shield, what is your current, you weren't able to write about the current conflict in the Gaza Strip in your book. So what would you kind of add as a summary, like addendum to your book as it relates to the human shielding subject in Gaza in the current genocide?
So what we see in Gaza is the increase. We see in Gaza 3 changes that are very important to our understanding of human shieldings that are new. One is the one we discussed before, is the scale.
Right.
Suddenly a whole region, a whole political entity is all considered one big shield. And so everything above ground can be cast as a shield and therefore legitimately bombed, where the blame will then go to Hamas, okay? So that is one change. Then we saw another change in Gaza, unprecedented in the history of human shielding, and that is that the IDF, when it has been using human shields in Gaza, and it has been using a lot of Palestinians as human shields in Gaza, instead of sending them in the tunnels or into buildings or to walk in front of the troops in their own civilian clothes, it detains them, dresses them in IDF military uniform, and then have them walk into the tunnels or before the buildings. Now, the reason is interesting. Human shields usually wear civilian garb, civilian clothes, and those that want to attack the forces that the human shield is shielding recognize the civilianhood of this person. They also often recognize that it's a co-patriot, and that is supposed to create deterrence, not to shoot, so that the person defends the people behind them. The human shield defends the combatants behind them. Okay, so it's a kind of of politics of vulnerability. The defense comes from the idea that this is a vulnerable body, flesh and blood of a co-patriot. We will not kill it, and therefore we will also not kill the combatants behind it. Comes Israel and uses perfidy, which is also a war crime, dresses civilians in IDF military. Now, what it wants to do is it wants to draw the fire of Hamas to these people so that it can identify where Hamas is shooting from and attack Hamas. Now, what this is unprecedented. We've never seen this in any conflict zone. What it tells us that in terms of the soldiers that are using these people as human shields, that they're like bait. So if Gallant called the Palestinians human animals, they are treating Hamas as if they are kind of animals looking for prey, and they're taking civilians, dressing them in military garb, and using them as bait for the Hamas fighters. And this we've never seen anywhere. It's about what's called the thingification of the colonized, the treatment of the colonized as mere fodder, a mere object. Okay? Now, the last and maybe most important change is this. Israel, as South Africa has claimed, is carrying out genocide. The International Court of Justice has ruled that Israel is plausibly carrying out genocide and that it wants to investigate this and have hearings about it. Now, the laws of war as we know them today are the 1949 Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols of 1997. The 1949 additional Geneva Conventions were drafted after World War II as a consequence of the horrors of World War II. And the major message of this body of law was never again. We never again want a genocide. We have created this new legal order. We've put it in place. We've codified the laws in order to ensure a never again. And here you have Israel using that same body of law and the human shield clauses, and indeed they use the human shield clauses in The Hague at the ICJ hearing to justify its attacks. So it's using the same legal order that was created in order to ensure that there will never be a genocide again in order to justify genocidal violence. So if Israel gets away with this interpretation of what is going on in the field and this use of the laws of war, then the laws that were created to stop genocide will be put to use to justify genocide.
Obviously, the accusation of human shielding has been levied ad nauseum against Hamas, whether it be by Israel or whether it be by the United States. And in this conversation, we've referenced proximate human shielding that obviously occurs in the Gaza Strip because of the nature of the Gaza Strip being akin to an open-air prison or an open-air concentration camp. But I guess my question to you is that this accusation is weaponized so frequently, but in your study of human shielding in the Gaza Strip, how much have you seen evidence of Hamas actually taking involuntary human shields, not just being in proximity because there's really no choice but to be in proximity to civilians in the Gaza Strip, but how much evidence is there to Israel's claim that Hamas has actually involuntarily taken human shields and put them around military bases or weapon supplies and things like that?
There's no evidence of that. And if Hamas would do that, Israel would kill so if let's say you were a Palestinian civilian and I a Hamas militant, and I took you and put you in front of me as I walked in order to defend myself, Israel would kill you. What there is evidence. So they won't even try, and they wouldn't do it to their own people. I mean, it's not something that they would.
If they're willing to bomb an apartment building full of families because there's one alleged Hamas operative in that, it seems that human shielding wouldn't be involuntary human shielding wouldn't be a very effective deterrent in the Gaza Strip against the IDF.
No, there's no evidence. What Hamas does, I assume, at least not to the extent that Israel is claiming, that it might hide weapons in a protected site. I don't know, but it might. But even that, to use that as a claim to bomb a school or a hospital is extremely problematic. First, Israel did it itself. And I wrote an article after October 7th showing how Israel hid arms in synagogues, how Israel hid arms in schools, and how Israel hid arms in clinics before 48 in its struggle against the British. And the British occupiers, the British colonizers in Palestine, never bombed a school, never bombed a hospital, and never bombed a synagogue when Israel did that. Okay, the fact that Hamas might be hiding RPGs in a mosque, in my opinion, is not a reason to bomb a mosque and so forth. And other warring parties that have been confronted with similar situations did not react like Israel's reacting. And Israel is reacting in this way not because there might be some RPGs in the hospital, but because Israel wants to destroy the life-saving institutions in the Gaza Strip, because it is on a project, as its leaders say, day in and day out, on a project of ethnic cleansing, taking over the Gaza Strip and eliminating the Palestinians. So the human shield is such a great weapon for Israel. It is the prime excuse for the kind of genocidal violence it is using.
And that's an interesting dimension that you just highlighted there as well, which also references something that you brought up about state versus non-state actors, and like this concept of human shielding. Even the IDF, or I guess it wouldn't be the IDF at this point, it would be either the Haganah or the Irgun or the Lehi, prior to the establishment of Israel, was doing these kinds of things because they were non-state actors. They were a paramilitary or guerrilla organization. So they really had no choice but to put weapons in synagogues or these other places. And this is what I think of a lot when I think of Hamas or militant groups in the Gaza Strip. This is an occupied territory. It's not something that can just freely have a standing military. There's not a Hamas military base that is, has a bunch of uniformed Hamas soldiers that can walk around and do military endeavors, and they can't have a weapons depot over here that's manufacturing weapons far away from the civilian population. They are acting as a kind of political guerrilla insurgency. So like when I hear people say these things about human shielding, it's like, oh, they put their weapons and their fighters near civilians. I mean, is there even a way that they could conceivably not do that with the nature of the occupied Gaza Strip?
I don't think there's an example in history that shows something like that. So no. The answer, and particularly in Gaza, it's like the most dense, one of the most dense places in the world, as you called it, an open air prison. It's like, how are you going to do it? So it's like Warsaw. If we look at the Warsaw Rebellion, okay, they hid weapons in Warsaw, and they rebelled against the forces that were holding them there in the ghetto, and that, I would hope, is not a justification for flattening the whole ghetto.
Right. Neve, thank you so much for this conversation. I know we're getting towards the end of our time here. Just before you go, I just wanted to ask you if you had any projects or things places where people can follow you and keep up with the work that you're doing, if you wanted to inform any of our audience about that.
I'm a bit on social media, not so much. I'm working now on the starvation and on attacks on hospitals. Both issues are of major concern in what is going on in Gaza, and frightening, so to speak. So, yeah, I think we just need to continue struggling against what's going on out there so that this world will be a better place to live in.
And, as great as this conversation was, and as much as I love this book, in the future, we'd love to maybe get a copy of another one of the books that you read that, and maybe invite you on for another conversation.
I'd love that. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Neve, thank you so much. For anybody listening, if you want a great resource for contextualizing the current genocide that's going on in Gaza and the propaganda that's being weaponized to justify it, definitely grab yourself a copy of this book. And it's a really, really interesting read. So Neve Gordan, thank you so much again. We appreciate you coming out.
Thank you.
So don't run around here trying to make friends with somebody who's depriving you of your rights. They're not your friends. No, they're your enemies. Don't treat them like that and fight them, and you'll get your freedom. My repertoire is USSR. PLO style, PLO style got thrown out the car. Rise for subversive plots. They'll call you an extremist or subversive or red radical. Rise for subversive plots. Red radical, and fight them. Capitalism and democracy, capitalism and democracy are not synonymous. We group us up like ants in a colony.